History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spectacular people. Welcome to History Goes Bump Redux. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this Redux, we're going back to a big one. I think everybody's probably heard of this location, Eastern State Penitentiary.
Looking forward to redoing this episode.
I've been holding off because I was hoping that we'd be able to visit it before we redid it, but probably not in the cards anytime soon. So I was like, well, let's go ahead and get in there and redo this one.
Looking forward to it.
Are you ready to go back?
I'm ready. Prisons had once been thought of as just holding areas to punish people. In the late 1800s, a movement started that aspired to a higher ideal of reform rather than punishment. Eastern State Penitentiary was built to launch that reformation in the American penal system. The prison's edifice is formidable and resembles a castle. This eventually became the most famous prison in the world. The prison ran for 142 years and today serves as a museum that offers both historical and ghost tours and hunts. Officers, inmates, staff, and visitors have all reported haunting activity for decades at the prison. Join us as we explore the history and hauntings of the Eastern State Penitentiary.
The period after the American Revolution was considered a time of enlightenment in America. Great American thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Paine, and Benjamin Franklin were challenging traditional beliefs when it came to religion, science, and politics. 6 major ideas to come out of the Enlightenment were deism, conservatism, liberalism, toleration, republicanism, and scientific progress. The adoption of rational and humanistic principles developed during the Enlightenment affected prison reform and design. As we know from previous podcasts on prisons, which we've done many, it's our favorite thing to investigate, Kelly.
Certainly is.
Many of these institutions were basically large holding pens where all genders and ages were thrown in together. Always blows our mind that you would have children in with adults and women in with men. Abuse by prison guards and overcrowding was the norm. With prison reform came changes to the American prison system.
In 1829, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons opened Eastern State Penitentiary, an experiment in correcting behavior through solitary confinement and reform instead of punishment. The society began in 1787 and met in the home of Benjamin Franklin. The group was led by Benjamin Rush, and he expressed a desire that the group make a goal of having Philadelphia become the place known internationally for prison reform. The group believed that causing prisoners to have penitent hearts would lead to them reforming. That is why this prison was called a penitentiary. Advocates for the system believed that if inmates were left alone for long enough, away from the dirty outside world, a criminal's innate morality would prevail and straighten them out. Eastern State was considered the world's first true penitentiary. Its system of incarceration was considered revolutionary, dubbed the Pennsylvania system or separate system. Inmates were held in separate confinement as a form of rehabilitation. The warden was legally required to visit every inmate every day, and the overseers were mandated to see each inmate 3 times a day. Eastern State was designed by John Haviland and opened its doors on October 25, 1829.
Originally, inmates were to be housed in cells that could only be accessed by entering through a small exercise yard attached to the back of the prison. A small portal, just large enough to pass meals, opened onto the cell blocks. This design proved impractical, and in the middle of construction, cells construction was changed to allow prisoners to enter and leave the cell blocks through metal doors that were covered by a heavy wooden door to filter out noise. The halls were designed to have the feel of a church. It was believed by some that the doors were built small so that the prisoners would have a harder time getting out, thus minimizing an attack on a security guard. And when you see these cell doors, if you are a 6-foot guy, you're going to clock your head if you don't duck down to get into them. This design is kind of like a wagon wheel, how the Disney park set up where you've got the central hub, they called it the rotunda, and then all of these hallways would come off of it into each of the cell blocks. I thought it was kind of fun, although Zach Bagans drives me nuts. When I was watching their investigation of this, there were numbers that were above each of the hallways that they've put there now for the tours and everything.
Right.
And so he was like, what's behind door number 1? And then he would say whatever prisoner had been down there and, it's not something you'd want to run into. Or would you choose what's behind door number 7? And so I thought it was kind of funny. But it gave me a good feel for how the jail was set up. And there were these vaulted ceilings in the hallways and in some of the cells, and that's why they said it was kind of built to give them this feeling like they were in a church. This design forced the appearance of penance and ties to the religious inspiration of the prisons. The cells were made of concrete with a single glass skylight representing the eye of God, suggesting to the prisoners that God was always watching them. Watching, always watching.
Mm-hmm. Always watching, Wachowski. Throwback to Monsters Incorporated.
Fear was a key to instilling in prisoners a desire to never return to jail. Early prisoners were petty criminals, muggers, purse snatchers, pickpockets, burglars, etc. First-time offenders often only served 2 years. Eastern State was intended to move the criminal towards spiritual reflection and change, and not simply punishment. Proponents of the system believe that the criminals, if exposed in silence to the thoughts of their behavior and the ugliness of their crimes, would become penitent.
There was an individual area for exercise outside each cell. High walls enclosed each yard so prisoners could not communicate. Exercise time was synchronized so that no 2 prisoners next to each other would be out at the same time. Prisoners were allowed to garden and to keep pets in their exercise yards. A hood was placed over the head of a prisoner by a guard when he left his cell. This was to prevent the prisoners from recognizing one another. Each individual cell had a faucet with running water over a flush toilet, as well as curved pipes along part of one wall, which served as central heating during the winter months. Hot water would be run through the pipes to keep the cells reasonably heated. Toilets were remotely flushed twice a week by the guards of the cell block. The original design of the building was for 7 one-story cell blocks, but by the time cell block 3 was completed, the prison was already over capacity.
All subsequent cell blocks had 2 floors. Toward the end, cell blocks 14 and 15 were hastily built due to overcrowding. They were built and designed by prisoners. Cell block 15 was for the worst-behaved prisoners, and the guards were gated off from them entirely. Inmates were punished with the individual treatment system. At the time, this form of punishment was thought to be most effective. Due to overcrowding, the solitary confinement system eventually collapsed. Obviously, if you are having overcrowding issues, you can't be like, oh, each of you gets your own individual cell and can't talk to each other. By 1913, Eastern State officially abandoned the solitary system and operated as a congregate prison until it closed in 1970. After a riot at Holmesburg Prison in 1971, Eastern State was used briefly to house city inmates. Eastern State was one of the largest public works in the early days of the United States.
The reality of Eastern State was anything but reformatory. The guards and counselors designed a variety of physical and psychological torture regimens for various infractions. Prisoners would be doused in freezing water outside during winter months.
That would just do me in. I'd be like, okay, I'll do whatever you want me to do.
Yeah. The iron gag was an iron collar strapped around the tongue and chained to the inmate's wrists in a fashion such that struggling against the chains could cause the tongue to tear.
I can't even imagine how painful that would be.
Many inmates bled to death during this punishment. Other prisoners were strapped into the mad chair with tight leather restraints that prevented any movement and cut off circulation for days on end and given no food. The worst behaved prisoners were put into a pit called the Hole, which was an underground cell dug under cell block 14 where they would have no light, no human contact, and little food for as long as 2 weeks at a time.
In the 19th century, Eastern State was a tourist destination. Charles Dickens and Alexis de Tocqueville were two of the most notable visitors. Visitors were able to speak with prisoners in their cells, proving that inmates were not isolated. However, prisoners themselves were not allowed to have any visits from family or friends during their incarceration. In 1831, after visiting Eastern State, Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont wrote in their report to the French government, "Thrown into solitude, the prisoner reflects. Placed alone in view of his crime, he learns to hate it. And if his soul be not yet surfeited with crime, and thus have lost all taste for anything better, it is in solitude where remorse will come to assail him. Can there be a combination more powerful for reformation than that of a prison which hands over the prisoner to all the trials of solitude, leads him through reflection to remorse, through religion to hope, makes him industrious by the burden of idleness?"
Charles Dickens did not agree. He visited Eastern State in 1842, and in Chapter 7 of his travel journal, American Notes for General Circulation, Dickens writes, "In its intention, I am well convinced that it is kind, humane, and meant for reformation. But I am persuaded that those who design the system of prison discipline, and those benevolent gentlemen who carry it into execution, do not know what it is that they are doing. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. And because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye, and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear, therefore I more denounce it, as a secret punishment in which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay."
Several guards were killed at the prison. One officer, Michael T. Doran, was murdered in the 1830s by an inmate who disassembled part of a sewing machine and clubbed Doran to death in the exercise yard. That inmate was Joseph Taylor, and he was convinced that the guards were trying to poison him. In court, Taylor said that he remembered hitting the guard the first time, but he didn't remember any of the rest of the attack. And after the attack, he just went back into his cell and fell asleep. Some guards were pushed over the railings to their deaths. The railings were so close to the cells that it wouldn't take much for a prisoner to just reach out and push a guard as he's walking by to go over the railing. So they installed these bars that kind of went through the opening so that at least if the guard went over the railing, he didn't fall all the way down. There were dozens of suicides by inmates, one of which was blamed on masturbation. Kelly? Not quite sure how that worked.
Causes suicide by masturbating?
Yeah, they were going through these books that were the deaths and what people died from. And there was one that was what they put as the cause of death.
Okay. I've heard the story that sometimes parents will tell their children that if you keep doing that, you're going to go blind, but I've never heard of that.
Yeah, they were wondering if maybe that's why they put it down that way, because they were trying to dissuade them from doing that kind of thing. Another inmate sliced his own throat.
Ay.
I never, when I hear stories of that, I'm like, how does somebody do that to themselves? Other inmates died from illness, and a few were murdered by fellow inmates.
Some of America's most notorious criminals were held at Eastern State. Gangster Al Capone found himself in front of a judge for the first time in May 1929 and was sentenced to 1 year in Eastern State for a concealed weapons charge. He spent most of that sentence in relative comfort. Capone was allowed to furnish his cell with antique furniture, oriental rugs, oil paintings, and a cabinet radio. He was allowed special privileges, like being allowed to conduct business through the warden. There was also Morris the Rabbi Bulber. He was the leader of an arsenic murder ring. People referred to him as a veteran witch doctor and compounder of charms. Their main clientele were women who wanted to kill their husbands for insurance money. The group had killed 30 people. The rabbi was serving a life sentence at Eastern State. Leo Callahan was arrested for assault and battery with intent to kill. He was the only inmate to successfully escape Eastern State and stay at large. He was never recaptured. He used a makeshift wooden ladder to accomplish this feat. The 5 Buzzard brothers all served time at the prison. Joe Buzzard was one of the best horse thieves in the country. There were women at the prison for 100 years, and Frida Frost was the last female at the jail. She had poisoned her husband and killed him.
Wonder if she'd hired the rabbi's group for that.
I bet she would have.
Bank robber Slick Willie Sutton was apprehended on February 5, 1934, and sentenced to serve 25 to 50 years in Eastern State for the machine gun robbery of the Corn Exchange Bank in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On April 3, 1945, Sutton was one of 12 convicts who escaped the institution through a tunnel. Sutton was recaptured the same day by Philadelphia police officers. This had been his 5th escape attempt at Eastern State. Willie Sutton claimed to be the mastermind of the tunnel escape. The truth is that the escape was planned and largely executed by Clarence Kleine Kleindienst, a plasterer, stonemason, burglar, and forger who looked a little like a young Frank Sinatra and had a reputation as a first-rate prison scavenger. Willie Sutton said, "If you give Kleine 2 weeks, he could get you Ava Gardner. If you give Kleine a year, he could get you out of prison." And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
Like something out of Shawshank Redemption, the escapees used spoons and flattened cans as shovels and picks. The tunnel crew, who worked in 2-man teams for 30-minute shifts, slowly dug a 31-inch opening through the wall of cell 68. They then dug 12 feet straight down into the ground and another 100 feet out beyond the walls of the prison. They removed dirt by concealing it in their pockets and scattering it in the exercise yard. They shored it up with scaffolding, illuminated, and even ventilated the tunnel. At about the halfway point, it linked up with the prison's brick sewer system, and the crew created a working connection between the 2 pipelines to deposit their waste while ensuring the noxious fumes were kept out of the tunnel. The tunnel escaped inspection several times thanks to a false panel Kleine treated to match the plaster of the cell and concealed by a metal wastebasket.
After months of painfully slow labor, the tunnel was ready. On the morning of April 3, 1945, the 12 prisoners made their escape, sneaking off to cell 68 on their way to breakfast. After all the designing, carving, digging, and building, Kleine made it a whole 3 hours before getting caught. He had fared better than Sutton, who was free for only 3 minutes. By the end of the day, half the escapees were returned to prison while the rest were caught within a couple months. The first few escapees to be captured, including Sutton, were put in the Klondikes. The Klondikes were illegal confinement cells that were completely dark and had been secretly built by guards in the mechanical space below one of the cell blocks. These spaces were miserable, tiny holes that weren't big enough to stand up in or wide enough to lie down. So I'm thinking they had to just be kind of in the fetal position.
Good grief.
The tunnel itself was analyzed and mapped, and then guards filled it with ash and covered it with cement. Until 2005, the location of the tunnel was lost. A nonprofit dedicated to preserving the landmark prison completed an archaeological survey to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the escape. To find the tunnel, the group created a search grid over the prison grounds near the entrance, the location of which was known from old photos. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team was able to create vertical sections through the site in increments corresponding to the suspected width of the tunnel. After a couple failed attempts, the archaeologists detected a section of the tunnel that hadn't collapsed and hadn't been filled in by the guards. A year later, a robotic rover was sent through the tunnels, documenting its scaffolding and lighting systems. How cool. We need to find that video. I'm sure they have it somewhere.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. There were riots in 1919, 1924, 1923, and the worst one in 1942, in which there was a loss of lives. All the riots were started due to a lack of quality food and poor conditions, and the inmates were demanding better. In 1942, Eastern State instituted a cutback of food items, some of which included sugar and coffee. No, not the coffee.
For me, it'd be the sugar. I would burn mattresses for sure.
Because of these reductions, some of the inmates started a protest. During the meal periods, inmates implemented their own form of a hunger strike by refusing to eat anything but coffee. When their demands were not met, mattresses were set afire and the riot began. Did you give them that idea?
Yes, I did.
Or did they give it to you?
They gave it to me.
Because of heavy rain, smoke from the fire was driven down the ventilation shaft to where an inmate named Joseph Ansensky was and suffocated him. 2 more inmates were overcome by the fire and 1 was killed during the riot.
By the 1960s, Eastern State was in very bad shape. The cost of repair was too high, and by 1970, the doors were closed. The city of Philadelphia bought Eastern State in 1980 and planned to refurbish and repurpose the building. That was unsuccessful, and the Pennsylvania Prison Society took over the prison in 1994 and opened it for tours. In 1997, it was turned into a museum. Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site Inc. took over management in 2001. Every Halloween, the prison is opened as a haunted house attraction, and many people believe that Eastern State is really haunted. As early as the 1940s, guards and inmates reported mysterious visions and eerie experiences. The reports have only increased since the closing in 1970.
An apparition has been seen many times up in the guard tower. Everybody knows this is a ghost because there is no way to access the guard tower anymore. Unexplained noises are heard. Weeping is heard. There is also giggling. The infirmary is said to be the most haunted area of the prison. A locksmith named Gary Johnson was working in cell block number 4 to remove a 140-year-old lock from the cell door. He suddenly was overcome by some kind of force that seemed to possess his body. He was unable to move. It was similar to sleep paralysis, only the locksmith had not been sleeping. Legend has it that when the locksmith removed the lock, he opened a gateway for spirits to come through, almost as if the spirits of the jail had been locked up here. The negative energy pulled the locksmith towards it. He claimed to see hundreds of distorted forms and faces filled with anguish on a cell wall. Every time he recalled the experience, he shuddered.
Al Capone experienced his own personal haunting at Eastern State. Other inmates said they could hear Capone screaming at somebody named Jimmy in his cell to go away and leave him alone. He was tormented every night. The prisoners assumed he was talking to the ghost of James Clark, a man whom he murdered at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. James Clark was the brother-in-law of Bugs Moran. And we did do an episode on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that's back in our archive. Maybe eventually we will redo that one as well. And I've actually been to the location where that massacre did happen. It's now basically a parking lot and apartment building, but I've seen it.
Cell block 12 has disembodied voices that echo through the block, and occasionally cackling is heard. The sound of footsteps in the dirt is also a regular occurrence. On the 3rd floor of that same block, a tour guide claims that the cell doors were closed one minute and then wide open the next. Cell block 6 features several shadowy figures that dart along the walls. Wails, whispers, and footsteps are heard in many areas, and there is never anyone there to make the sounds.
Eastern State has been featured on nearly every paranormal program that's out there. As a little fun fact, Kelly, we like to every so often throw into an episode,
"Dude, run!"
Well, we're making fun of a moment that happened during a Ghost Hunters episode, and it was during their episode featuring the investigation of Eastern State. Brian Harnoy, I think is how he said his name, was the one who made that infamous cry. It was because this dark, shadowy thing seemed to go across him, freaked him out, he fell backwards, and then he was like, let's run. And then when they looked back at everything, it looked like it was maybe somebody's shoe and a pant leg or something, and there wasn't really anything to be afraid of. And the next thing you know, Brian is no longer part of Ghost Hunters. They made that visit in 2004. The program manager at the time told the crew that he had heard ghostly footsteps when alone, and visitors and staff had seen a shadow come out of cell block 12 on the 2nd floor and simply stand there. The crew did capture what looked like the apparition of a man walking through cell block 12 later. It is this weird, misty, shadowy, I don't know, it's not an actual, like you're looking at a human form. It's almost like a cloud, and it's like way back in the hallway, and it starts coming forward like it's coming at the camera, and then it just kind of dissipates. It is a very weird anomaly. Is it paranormal? I don't know. Was it something trying to manifest? I don't know, but it's definitely weird. Travel Channel's Most Haunted also visited, and they recorded objects moving on their own.
Ghost Adventures visited during Season 2, Episode 6 in 2009. Author Catherine Driver told Zach that she was walking through with a group of people, and they were talking about food because they were planning lunch for later. And they all heard an audible,
Yeah, somebody was hungry too.
Then they felt a cold chill go right past them that gave them goosebumps. She also claimed that she was slapped on the butt by something she couldn't see.
And she just happened to be in the shower block area, Kelly.
Well, reminds me of a little episode that we covered with me in the shower.
She was facing the pipes. The wall is like right there. There was barely enough room to stand between the pipes and the wall. So there was like no chance for anybody to be directly behind her. She did think it was somebody in the group that was maybe kind of behind and next to her, but when she turned, there was like nobody next to her at all.
A tour guide told Zach that he had a group of 40 people with him, and he had turned them loose to wander around on their own. He noticed that one person was lagging behind, so he turned to tell the person that they needed to hurry up, and he didn't see anybody. He did a quick 360 because he knew he had seen someone, and that was when he noticed somebody walking down the hall of one of the cell blocks. And this entity got thinner and thinner until it faded away. Another person who had been on a tour was pushed back forcefully out of a cell. The Ghost Adventures crew captured an EVP of a breathy voice saying, "I knew God. God." They heard an audible voice say, "Hungry." They also captured an EVP saying, "Hi."
Samantha wrote on Reddit, "About 11 years ago, I got the chance to spend a few hours at night in the prison. At the time, the show Ghost Hunters was really popular, and there was an event held featuring Jason Hawes, Grant Wilson, Steve Gonzalez, and other people that are a part of the paranormal field, such as John Zaffis, Chris Fleming, and Chip Coffey. Those are a few that I recall off the top of my head. The guy who played Andy in the first two Child's Play movies was there as well, which sounds odd, but he was a huge fan of the Ghost Hunter show, apparently. The event as a whole was pretty neat. I'm not a paranormal investigator, but I've had many experiences, and it intrigues me. I also really wanted to experience the prison at night. I'm so glad I did because it was definitely interesting. In the infamous cell block 12, I witnessed many dark shadows flitting from cell to cell, flying across one side to another. I actually experienced something like that at Waverly Hills. You know, I tell you I've never seen shadow figures. If I have, it would be on the 4th floor of Waverly Hills. But because I can't definitively say that that's what I was seeing and that it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. I mean, there were other people saying, "Oh, I can see a shadow figure poking out of a door. Yeah, I see that one. It's a little bit lower." It was kind of a shared experience, but I was so, I don't know, my eyes are maybe playing tricks with me that I won't say I definitely saw shadow figures.
Did you ever ask Matthew Deegan if he saw anything as he walked down that hallway by himself?
I don't think I did. He didn't say anything as he was walking out because he spread his arms out like they were out like you'd be on a cross or something like that and just walked down the hall. There was this ambient light at the other end. That's why I thought maybe it was something playing tricks on my eyes. And he didn't say anything about seeing stuff like jumping out at him. It looked like, if that's what these were, it did look like they were jumping out at him.
Interesting.
At one point, Grant scared the crap out of me by popping out of a cell all excited, telling me I had to go in and check it out because he'd been hearing footsteps in it. Sure enough, after a few minutes of standing still and silent in the middle of the room, I began to get this feeling of being watched. Nobody was outside of the cell. It began to get uncomfortable. The best way I can describe it is it felt like someone was circling me. And then I did hear a few scraping steps going around me. So feeling like somebody's going around her and then actually hearing it, that's pretty cool. Sort of. Later, it's cool. Later that night, Chris Fleming took a group of us to another cell block and asked if anyone felt they were sensitive and happened to have a recorder. I did, and he had everyone else line up alone, each side of the long corridor, and instructed me to walk down the center asking questions or picking people to ask one of their own. I was wearing sneakers, so my feet didn't make a sound, and everybody else was told to remain quiet unless I tapped on them. Just as I reached a girl about a quarter of the way down, I was about to tap on her shoulder when suddenly the sound of heavy boots came from the catwalk above us. There's no railing up there, so it's not in use. No one goes up there. We both looked up, and of course, there's nothing there, but the boot falls were clear as day, then faded into nothing. The girl and I confirmed that we both heard it, but strangely, only those of us right near that spot had heard it. No one else further down did. Later, when I listened to my recorder, I had in fact caught the footsteps both in the cell I stood in as well as the cell block.
That's very cool.
That's great, because it's hard to catch footsteps like that. The really creepy thing was that I also got an EVP from the cell that was this deep male voice whispering. I wish that I still had that recorder, but it got lost during a move.
There was a dog here named Pep, and he has reportedly been seen and heard throughout the prison. Pep was given free rein in life to go wherever he pleased, and so he is spotted all over in the afterlife. Eastern State has seen much pain and loneliness in its time. Are the spirits of former inmates still here in the afterlife? Are there dark and evil entities within the walls of the jail? Is Eastern State Penitentiary haunted?
That is for you to decide. One day we will get to Eastern State. Maybe.
And then we can just do a visit
Yeah.
episode.
Want to thank you guys for joining us on this Redux. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.